From New Hampshire Public Radio and the Howe Library in Hanover, New Hampshire, you're listening to Check This Out, a new literary series where we dive deeply into the works of emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. I'm your host, Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novel Atomic Anna. I am thrilled to be able to share these conversations with you over the next few weeks. Today on the show, my guest is Andrew Boryga, and we will be discussing his debut novel, Victim. Boryga has described the book succinctly as a Bronx kid pimps out his identity to achieve his dream of being a successful writer, but loses himself in the process. I'd add to that, this Bronx kid is an unreliable narrator who pulls us into the world of diversity politics and buzzwords, into a world where we're never sure what is true and what is a lie, and the author seems to be asking, is this fiction that different from the real world? Andrew, welcome to Check This Out. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's an honor to be here.
So, you described this book as a Bronx kid pimps out his identity.
Yeah.
Let's start there. What does that mean?
Yeah. So Javi, the narrator, protagonist of the novel, basically he's somebody who, wants to be a successful writer and realizes very early on that his particular background, the trauma that he's experienced, the trauma that of others around him in his neighborhood community, um, when wielded in a certain way, kind of gets attention and notoriety that can kind of streamline his plans to be a successful writer, whatever that means to him. And as soon as he sort of peeps the game and understands it, he starts to lean into it. And slowly it builds into things getting out of control and going far beyond probably what he ever imagined.
So, to be a little more specific, Javi, your protagonist, he grows up in the Bronx. He has Puerto Rican parents and he's raised by his mom. His dad isn't really around. When he's 12, he witnesses his father's fatal shooting. And that's rough, right? A lot of people would look at that and say that's rough. But Javi himself says, there are people around me who have it a lot worse. Like, it's not that rough. And he really doesn't start labeling himself as anything until someone calls him a victim for the very first time. And that's really, I think, the moment when we see him starting to pimp out that identity, because he talks about there's a high from being called a victim.
Yeah, I think it's all it's a lot about his perception of himself versus the outside world of him, right? And particularly, that labeling of victim status comes from this guidance counselor who works at a very sort of prestigious elite school that is coming to his poor public school to counsel him. So it's kind of this outsider perspective onto him. But even though he has lived through things that he's, that have been difficult, that he is struggling with, again, like you said, he has this different perspective where he's looking around and he's like, well, I don't have my dad, but my single mom is excellent. And, I have a lot of other things that are kind of going for me that comparatively to friends of mine, other people in my community, like I have it good. Right. But that sort of clashes with this like outsider label onto him where so he now is trying to understand like, what is he and what is he not? But more importantly, he realizes that the sort of victim label comes with some like currency to it, and he's kind of more interested in that question anyway.
Can you give me some examples? So he says he starts to lean into this high that he feels from being called a victim. Like, can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, I think he gets first of all he gets preferential treatment at school, right? After his father is killed, he comes back, and all of a sudden people are like, well, you don't have to do the classes if you don't want to. You can go to the nurse's office. You can sort of take a break whenever you need it, which is probably useful. But he starts to see it as like a perk. He says, okay, well, I can go to sleep. I can take naps. He says it's like skincare. It gets better because he's getting more rest. And that's like a small thing, right? He's getting attention and he kind of likes attention. But then he meets his guidance counselor and the perks become bigger to him, right? The guidance counselor is like, well, if you write this story in a certain way, you can go to these really fancy elite schools for free. And he doesn't really believe that at first. He's kind of, what do you mean for free? There's no way. But then it turns out to be true. And so again, he's given access to this sort of elite space now, and now he's in his mind, all of these things are happening because he is, allowing himself to be seen in this lens as a victim. And so he, in his mind, it's like, okay, this is the path that I need to follow to get where I want to be.
So he follows this guidance, right? He leans into this victim label, and it lands him at Donlin University. And here he's labeled. He gets all these words put on him, like poor, underserved, disadvantaged, and he sees this real hunger for tragic stories. And this is really where we start to see him writing what he calls truth, which is not always his truth, but it's a truth somewhere, right? And this is where we sort of see the con man side to him.
Yeah, so college is a big arena for him. I think it's where he gets to kind of try out these these notions that he's having in high school. The awakening moment happens when he's a senior in high school, and then it's in college where he can kind of like exercise what he's learned. And it's there where he's taking, intro to sociology classes, Latino studies classes, other classes where his community, his experience growing up is sort of being framed in this like academic lens, like you mentioned, marginalized. Statistics are being read to him about outcomes that could have happened, and it's sort of a disorienting thing because it's not how he would see himself or his community. But again, he has this con man side, and he's kind of like every little inch that he's given, he takes it and more. So he's like, okay, if that's how you see me, I'm going to make sure to position myself that way to continue to keep getting the attention. And that leads to not only, a girlfriend on campus and sort of status, but then later this perch as like a columnist, opinion columnist in the college newspaper, which, later launches him to more opportunities.
Yeah, so this is really why I loved this book is because we're sitting here, our listeners can't see this, but we're smiling a little bit because we're talking about Javi as a con man. But this story is tragic. This is hard stuff that he's dealt with. And yet he's a con man, right? And he's leaning into it. And this humor, this lens of humor that you have used is so effective and such a great way into the story. And equally as effective, I think, is that you have written this book in the format of a memoir. It's fiction, to be clear. It is not your life, but you wrote it as Javi's memoir. Would you mind reading the first page for us so we can get a sense of Javi's voice?
Sure. I wasn't trying to play the victim until the world taught me what a powerful grift it is. Believe it or not, all I wanted was to be successful, to hustle like my pops, but keep my life and freedom in the process. My desperate chase after your approval was really all about that. I needed that approval to be considered successful. I needed it to feel like my life mattered. The truth is, I didn't create this racket. I was put on. I peeped game and I realized I happened to be uniquely equipped to thrive in it. You see, there are many ways to go about it, but the absolute easiest starting point is to actually have some tragic happen to you. It gives you something to pull from, a leg to stand on. I survived this. If you don't have that, but you have the right shade of skin, you'll be okay for now. If you don't have the tragic story or the right skin color, but you grew up in the right kind of place with the right kind of poverty and have the right kind of people to back up that story for you, you might be able to work something out. But if you don't have the tragic and you don't have the right skin color and you don't have the right geographic background, get out of the game entirely. It is just not for you. Take your privilege, earn your cash, invest in your stocks, and for the love of God, stay off of social media.
Thank you. Andrew, what an opening, right? Way to just pull us in there and right into this memoir, to this story. You know, right from page one, that Javi isn't quite telling the truth. Already he's unreliable, but already he's telling us his game. If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Andrew Boryga, and you're listening to Check This Out on New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about the brand new debut novel, Victim. So, Andrew, your protagonist, Javi, had a very tough background, and he wanted to be a writer. He wanted to become rich and famous as a writer. He was a little bit lazy, and he found as he was sort of working his way up that every time he wanted to lean into a story, the powers that be, the editors, were telling him to lean in from his perspective. They only wanted to hear his tragic stories or from his Puerto Rican background. How close is that to your own story?
I grew up also in the Bronx as well, and I started writing as a journalist myself. And I had this interesting experience where I was able to write for the New York Times quite young. When I was 18. This was back in like 2009, and I would try to pitch a lot of stories about the Bronx, and they kind of would never really take off. Um, never got any traction. But then somewhere around 2014, 2015 or so. there was this like widespread call for more diverse voices in the media and publishing. And as part of that, I started to get more opportunities that I wasn't necessarily given access to before, um, which was great. I was very happy to see that, and I thought the call was valid and important and needed. But I found, as I kept going on as a freelancer and working for different places, that often, yeah, like there was a certain type of story that was wanted from me. It was either my background in the Bronx or like something tragic that had happened in a urban community that was sort of similar to the one that I grew up in, or yeah, Puerto Rico hurricanes that were disaster, and these are important things to write about, and I enjoyed writing the pieces that I did write, and I still feel proud of them and stand by them. But I think I started to realize after a while that that was kind of the one lane that I was being the one door sort of open to me, and that felt frustrating. It felt like I was being pigeonholed, and when I would try to pitch things that were a little different, there'd either be no response or it'd be, I was even told a couple times like, I don't know if you have the chops to sort of pull that off right now or something. You know what I mean? Those sorts of things. And so it started to work in me, and I sort of thought at the end, by the end of it, it's like, do you really want diverse voices, or you want like diverse looking voices who are saying like these sorts of things, right? Because they're two different things, and if you want to listen to the totality, the real diversity, like it's going to sound different than what you might have expected, or have different interests or whatever. And I wasn't seeing that necessarily playing out in real life. So that definitely went into my crafting of Javi, and this idea of a character who, instead of me in real life, where I sort of pulled back and just like stopped freelance writing as much as I used to, somebody who leaned into it and was like, well, that's what you want. I'm going to give you exactly what you want, and I'm going to give it to you even better than what you were initially looking for.
Right, so that's where he starts to tell all of the lies, and the line blurs, right? It's someone's truth, but not his truth. And you describe that in the book really well. I think you call it like this tragic sitcom is what the editors are looking for, right? They want like a click. They want a quick, wow, that's a horrible story. Is that what you were feeling? Is like that's what the desire was?
Yeah, there was a lot of that, and I can't even necessarily always fault the editors for that either. I think a lot of it has to do with the funding mechanism right now for journalism, right? It's clicks, it's attention online, virality, and a lot of that is driven by outrage, um, you know, by sort of, I don't know if trauma is the right word, but it's like there's a certain type of catchy, eye-grabbing story that's going to get you to click on it and share it, and that's the sort of stories that a lot of these publications are chasing now, and a lot of them out of necessity to survive. Whereas when it was a different model and it was like advertising was healthy, I feel like there was kind of more room to explore, even if the people who were being allowed to explore maybe weren't as diverse. Now we have a sort of a different issue with like new faces in the building.
But also when you were writing this, I mean, in the real world, right, we had people like Jussie Smollett from Empire, who were faking stories, just like
Right,
Javi.
right. Yeah, which is interesting to see. Just Jesse Smollett, I think, happened around the time when I was actually still writing the book. So he was an interesting person. But then there's been, Hassan Minaj was another one who was sort of in the news recently. And if you go back, not necessarily faking stories of tragedy, but people like Jason Blair, which I think was back in the early 2000s, Stephen Glass, like people who were, also making up stories to sort of get where they wanted to be. So a lot of these people were in the ether, and I think Jason Blair in particular is somebody that I read his memoir as part of writing the book, and sort of like trying to understand his voice and like the voice of somebody who's already been taken down, so to speak, and how would they try to defend themselves, and that helped me think a lot about how I wanted to position Javi in this memoir that he's writing.
I mean, this push for clicks and this push for attention for your writing is fascinating because as a fiction writer, we also really value the quality of a sentence or a plot. It's not just the clicks, but at the same time, we have to sell books or we don't have a
Yeah.
career.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely it's something you could think about. I think there's writers who think about it, and there's those who don't. There are those who are just like, I'm going to write the weird thing that I want to write, um, and I really respect the latter. I think it's something that I this to me was a story that felt like this fun way of exploring issues and topics that I had a lot of questions about but no answers about. And I wanted to make plot part of it, but I also wanted it to be, um, I don't know, a little bit out there and challenging in different ways. So, you know, I think as a fiction writer, it's important to keep some of that stuff in mind, but we have a whole different medium, and it's important to also chase like the weirdness as well, or whatever that is to you.
So I think it's brave for you to put Javi out there and this story where he's this con man, right? He's not telling the truth, and to lay out this tension, this push for marginalized stories, and to put out these buzzwords. Has it made people uncomfortable?
I think so. Yeah. I've seen a lot of various reactions to it. There's people who are like, "Thank God you're telling this. This is, finally," or people who are like, "I love this, but I don't really know what to think about it by the end." Or there's people who are saying, there's an interesting critique like if this fell into the wrong hands, they're going to think that, people of color never have it bad, or they're just always lying about their stories, or so on. So there's been a lot of different reactions to it, and me as the writer, I'm happy to see that, because that to me that says the book did not give you some formulaic answer by the end where it's like this is what you're supposed to think, this is what you're supposed to take away, and that's precisely what I was going for. I did not want anyone to finish reading this and think, okay, I know what's right and what's wrong now, because I don't myself, right? I'm figuring that's why I wrote a novel and not a nonfiction, argumentative thing. A lot of this was about exploration of messy topics, and I think um, some some people reading that are they might be looking for the easier, sort of pat story. This is not it.
Yeah, but you are putting the conversation on the table, and I think that is really important, right? That's what we're doing on the show. That's why we're here, because I think, we start by changing things. We start to change things by having the conversation.
Yeah, yeah, and I thought, I thought that a novel where, hopefully it's entertaining, funny, has other elements to it. There's a friendship story at the end of it. It's like not only about this, but a novel with complex characters sort of in this world, like trying to figure these issues out, would be a good way to have people think deeply about it and talk about it and like take sides. It's been interesting to hear people say like, "I love Javi," or like, "I hate Javi, he's so annoying," or like, "I hate him, but I kind of understand him." It's been great to see these various reactions.
You're listening to Check This Out on NHPR. I'm Rachel Barenbaum, and my guest today is Andrew Boryga. We are talking about his brand new novel, Victim, and we are going to pick up again with some of the difficult conversations that have come out of the novel and the main protagonist, Javi. So, how did you come up with Javi? Did he start as you, or was he always a separate entity?
Yeah, no, he started when I was in college, and he was very much based off of me in the beginning. The story was really more concerned with Javi and Gio, his best friend in the novel, and how they had these divergent paths. They grew up in the same building in the Bronx, but went on these two different divergent paths. And really, I was trying to like understand my survivor's guilt by leaving the Bronx and going to a place like Cornell. I went to college and writing for New York Times and these places. And so he was very much attached to me in the first like 4 or 5 years, 5, 6 years probably. And slowly I started to let go of him a little bit more, and allow him to be his own person. And it was during that process where I started to realize, like, you know what, you know, he's kind of like playing, like I already started seeing inclinations of him playing this game. He was a writer as well, and addicted to attention. All these things, like as a social media sort of bubble was happening. Um, like I just started to see avenues to like take that further, right? Like because there was some truth in that as well for me in terms of social media. For example, there was a period where I cared a lot about my like Twitter following, or my presence online as a writer. I thought you had to have a certain type of presence, and the right certain people had to follow you and like you and whatever. And so with Javi, I think by the end of it, by like 2020, 2021, when I was really sort of in the meat of what the current version of the book is, I was able to see him as kind of like an alternative version of myself, where I was able to work through a lot of these things. Like I don't have that sort of relationship today to social media, but I could imagine somebody like me who has had the same sort of interests and passions as me going down an alternative direction that would have been a lot worse, right? So again, where I pulled back on writing some of these stories that were starting to make me feel icky, I was like, well, I'm gonna see what happens if somebody just dives into it. What does that look like? Where I pulled back from social media, I'm like, what if somebody was like so obsessed that they made that their whole goal in life to to get these sorts of followers or whatever. So he became really interesting at that point because I sort of let him be his own person and remove myself from the picture. But that's a long process to get there. It took about the 10 years of writing the book. So.
Yeah, to let go and make him he's unlikable too.
And make him like, yeah, I think that was honestly one of the biggest hurdles when he was so close to me. Is like I didn't want to make him do anything bad or seem bad, quote unquote bad, or unlikable, because then I'm like, well, people are going to think that about me, right? And I worried about that, and I was young, and so as I got older and more mature, I had my kids, I had my family, I had other things in my life going on. I was like, I just didn't care about that as much, and it was like I assume some readers are going to think he's me, and that's I can't really control that. But once I let that go, I was able to push him to like the furthest extremes, for the purpose of the novel, to really ratchet up the tension and the drama, and make things more exciting in ways that I couldn't do when I was so worried about protecting him.
There's no doubt this book is a conversation starter and a great conversation. Let's talk about Javi's journey. So he arrives at Donlin University, which is a made up university, but it's prestigious, leafy, maybe Ivy League, very rich, fancy. And he shows up for one of his very first classes, and there's a lecture. There are 300 kids in the room. And the professor starts off by asking everybody to stand up. Can you tell us about this scene?
Yeah, so he's there. He's professor's asking everybody to stand up, and he's trying to illustrate these class differences and differences between races in terms of outcomes in the United States. But he does so by asking questions like, if you have two parents, who are still married, sit down. If you live in a neighborhood that you consider safe, sit down. If your parents have this certain level of degrees, in terms of educational attainment, sit down. And it's one, slowly weeding out the entire room to the point where Javi is like the one kid left standing, and for all intents and purposes, is sort of seen like, well, this is the most marginalized person in the room, and he goes on to illustrate this idea of people starting on unequal footing and sort of where they end up as a result of that, which I think obviously is a real thing, but putting the reader in the perspective of Javi, the kid who's the one left standing, and everyone looking at him. I think it's a sort of twist that, like, on that, and sort of understanding like what it means to be given those messages, and then even more so when it's like Javi. You might imagine that a kid would be weirded out by that, or uncomfortable, but Javi's like, this is awesome. Everyone's looking at me.
Right, and that's a perfect example of the humor in this hard, horrible situation. What I thought this part did was it started a conversation in my head, right, as I'm reading this, because I was like, this is a really important thing for kids to go to college and realize everyone has come from a different background. We need to talk about that. But how do we talk about that? Not like this. We don't leave Javi standing in the room with everyone staring at him. But how do we all sitting in this room realize and talk about our differences?
Yeah, no, it's a big question, and it's not one that I necessarily had an answer to, but I knew like that experiment that I described in the novel, that was something I did experience. Not exactly that way. Obviously, I played it up, but I think those types of exercises they were run when I was in college. I don't know if they still are. Like you said, I don't know if that's the right way, because you're singling kids out. You're like, well, this is the poor one. Everybody look, see, you're right, and that's like that's messed up. It's like not the way to go about it. I think there are ways to discuss differences that, you know, um, maybe try to sidestep some of the labels. I think the labels themselves are quite heavy, and we can talk about class differences, wealth, income gaps, things like that are important, but without labeling the person on the lower end as like somehow damaged or wrong, or and I don't even think that comes like I'm not even think that's like a conscious thing that people are doing, but in just the terms and the sort of deference and the like, oh, you've had it, it's so hard being you, like these are, I don't know, those things never lined up for me as somebody who received some of that going to college and getting scholarships and things like that. I appreciated the support, but I was just kind of like, the way you're speaking about me, I don't see myself like that.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Andrew Boryga, and we are talking about his debut novel, Victim. You're listening to Check This Out on New Hampshire Public Radio. Andrew, back to your book and these really important conversations. You were just telling us that you heard some of those labels being given to you when you showed up at Cornell, and that wasn't how you felt.
Yeah, it was a very weird thing to experience because again, I came from, sort of like Javi, I came from a neighborhood where my father wasn't murdered or anything like that, but I did grow up with a single mom. We were not necessarily rich, but I didn't necessarily think of myself as poor either until I got to Cornell. Like that was when I was like, I'm poor. Okay. Like, because everyone else had so much more wealth and everything. And more so the way like when I would, we'd go around like, what did you do for the summer? Or like, what do your parents do? And it's like, people were like oil barons and they're investment bankers and I'm like, oh, my mom's a social worker in the Bronx. I don't know. You know what I mean? Like it felt just everything felt different in comparison. And it was very disorienting. But, I think those labels, like they just never felt right to me. Look, it's awesome that you want to help me, and I'll gladly receive that help. I'm not saying don't, because I saw in terms of the academic outcomes, like my schooling in a lot of ways was not at the same par or level. Like I had a lot more trouble with academics wise at Cornell. So I was like, yeah, I do need this help, but like you don't have to treat me like I'm the damaged banana either.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about that as this need for like the savior complex.
A lot of that plays into it. I think that the actual solutions to a lot of the problems, like in education, for example, which I'm very passionate about, they require like a lot bigger things than feeling bad, right? It's like they require like changing tax structures and like really big policy things that people don't really want to do sometimes, or integrating kids in different schools where it's like I care about you, but I don't care about you enough to be in my kid's school. So like there's bigger things that need to happen that I feel like the sympathy or the like, aw shucks kind of thing takes the place of that. And it's like that's nice, but that doesn't really, it's in a lot of ways it comes off as like a virtue signaling type thing. It's like I'm letting you know I'm a good one. I'm one of the good ones. And it's like okay, but what are we really addressing here?
Right. And so in the book, Javi, after this exercise in the class where he's with the 300 kids and he's the last one standing, this very beautiful girl comes over to him and he starts hearing some of these brand new words.
So Anais is a girl that catches his eye early on, and all of a sudden, after this experiment in the classroom where he's the one left standing, he gets her attention. And so again, it's another sort of perk, right? That Javi's like, okay, like not only am I getting into these schools, I'm getting scholarship money, whatever, like I'm getting the girls that I'm really trying to pine after as well. And Anais is a really interesting character because she is also Latina. Looking at her, you might imagine a similar background as Javi, but really she grew up in a very different context, in the suburbs, two-parent household makes good money, went to good schools. And she comes to Donlin and is sort of adopting a lot of these like activist slogans and tendencies and idealism in a lot of ways. Not because she doesn't believe it, because she does, but I think also because it makes her feel sort of more at ease with her identity on campus, or it makes her, sort of like feel comfortable with an identity she can get behind, and not be seen as what she starts to maybe understand that she more so is like have privilege, right? Which she doesn't really want to necessarily grapple with. She wants to remain in the like underprivileged label, and sees Javi as this sort of embodiment. He's the last one left standing, the most marginalized person. So she wants to sort of align herself with him as well. So they have sort of competing motivations for being with each other that I think are interesting to tease out.
And it opens his eyes to all of these academic terms and words, right, that he hadn't thought of before. But also, you write, one of the most insightful things I'd learned when I got to Donlin was about the wide range of Latinos or Hispanics or whatever the heck they wanted to call us. There were white ones, poor ones, dark ones, and rich ones who, despite their heavy accents, knew exactly what color ski slope was the hardest to go down. And this just opens his eyes to this whole new world. Let's talk about that.
With that, I was trying to hit on the wide range of diversity that is encapsulated in a term like Latino, right, or Hispanic. Um, and again, I did this purposely on the college campus because I think a lot of these again swath of people get tend to be bunched together. You're the Latino students, right? You're the Black students. You're the Asian students, and like there's so much diversity even within those little umbrellas, right? And that it sometimes doesn't even make sense to group all those people together in a lot of ways. Um, and I think that part of the novel is really opening Javi's eyes up to the fact that in his neighborhood Latinos, he doesn't really use the word Latino. It's like you're Spanish, right? You're Puerto Rican, you're Dominican, you're Black, you're Irish, Italian, something like that. And that's what you are. And then now he's a Latino, and now he's with his people in this group, and he's like, there's a whole range of us that he never, he didn't understand the diversity of South America, of the Caribbean, so so to speak. And a lot of that was, getting at some of my experience as well, going to school at Cornell, where I was exposed to like a new set of Latino diversity that I hadn't really encountered just growing up in the Bronx and mostly staying there, like going to Manhattan and stuff sometimes. But like again, El Barrio, which is again mostly Puerto Rican, maybe Mexican, right? So it's like the same sort of cultures, and then being confronted with like not only different cultures but different classes, and so it's like, are we really all part of the same group? Because when we're out together, some of them treat me just like the white students, and some of them who look like white students are actually had it harder, or like it's really it's messy, and it's harder. It's like those terms don't always encapsulate all that.
And yet, as a writer, when he gets his column, people are often looking to him to give the Latino experience or the Latino
Exactly.
perspective.
Yeah. Right. Right. Which is just a silly, and like to ask somebody to take up that mantle is just silly because it's impossible to do. It's like you cannot speak for that wide a range of people. It's impossible.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out on New Hampshire Public Radio. My guest today is Andrew Boryga. We are talking about his brand new debut novel, Victim. We've been talking a lot about Javi, the protagonist, and his love interest, Anais. And now I want to switch gears and really dig into Gio. So Gio is a childhood friend. Javi has grown up with him, and they had very separate, different paths. They, start in the same place and don't end in the same place. Let's hear about Gio, Andrew.
Yeah, Gio is a really important character, probably my favorite one in the book, to be honest. Again, yeah, he's a friend of Javi. They grew up together in the same building, and they basically end up taking these very divergent paths. Javi goes down the path of becoming this writer, good in school. And then Gio, he also doesn't have his mom, but also doesn't have his dad. He lives with his grandmother, doesn't have the same supervision that Javi has, and ends up falling into a gang, local gang in the neighborhood. Dealing drugs with them, living with them, and eventually being arrested and sent to prison for a long stretch of time. While he's in prison, Javi is entering Donlin and sort of getting this re-education about himself, his identity, these new words, his new ability to weaponize his background in different ways. And Gio is in prison, sort of like coming to grips with the choices he's made at this point in his life, and deciding eventually to like try to figure out something when he gets out to change it. And so they both are kind of going through these interesting educations. Well, he gets out, he meets up again with Javi, who by this point is a columnist at a fancy magazine, has all the followers he's been pining for, and sort of like, you know, at the status that he was always hoping for. But Gio, who knows him from when he was a kid, sees him and is like, sees what he's writing and looks at him a little bit like, what are you doing here? This is not you, and sort of like he's the person that kind of brings Javi back down to earth a little bit, just because of how long he's known him and how close they are.
Yeah, so Gio doesn't actually have tons of pages in the book, but he feels like the center of Javi's life. He is who grounds Javi.
Yeah, yeah, they're best friends. They're like almost like brothers, and I think Gio for me was he was based on a lot of friends that I had growing up, close friends like that who lived in the same building as me, or we went to elementary school, middle school, like these really formative experience together where we're like learning things and just hanging out and like exploring. I took this path of going to Cornell, writing through these magazines or newspapers and so on, and some of them ended up, addicted to drugs or going to jail, and sort of like I mentioned in the beginning, like a lot of the early version of this novel was trying to understand that divergence and what did that mean and why did I end up here and they ended up there. So Gio, I'm really happy he was in the novel because it gives it this like moral grounding center, this kind of heart in the middle of it. It's not just all the satire. It's like he's sort of the reminder that it's important to stay close to your community, stay close to people who truly care about you, especially in an environment we are now where a lot of people can get swept up in what's happening online or what attention they're getting from the outside world on these phones and these screens. Whereas I think a lot of us can stand to sort of go back to the places where we're like really known and really loved and make sure we're good there.
But the, contrast between Anais and Gio, right? She's really pushing Javi to, like, I don't know, sort of feel that maybe he does need to start lying and be someone he's not, whereas Gio is always like, "Come on, come back to yourself."
Yeah, yeah. Anais is just kind of more hip to the game a little bit, and I think she sees the potential in Javi. And I don't know if she doesn't necessarily tell him to lie, but she's sort of like play these things up. You have this background, you have these cards, like use them, right? Whereas Gio is sort of like Javi initially, before Javi got turned on to the guidance counselor and got this attention and so on, where it's like these things that happen to him, his trauma, his tragedy, these things that he can lean on. He doesn't necessarily see them in that lens, and so he knows Javi doesn't really either, and so he's kind of like, why are you doing this, and sort of like, why aren't you just being who you really are? You always wanted to write. Why don't you write the things you always really wanted to write, and instead of these fake things that you don't really even believe.
Would you mind pulling out a copy of the book again? Because I would love you to read one of the, conversations between Javi and Gio that I think really illustrate this.
Sure. I waited for Gio to lean forward, stare enraptured, inquire further. He groaned. You're gonna hit me with that conspiracy shit, aren't you? What conspiracy shit? The man is to blame for everything. We're just slaves caught up in a modern day plantation. The revolution is coming. You know how many people were spitting that shit in jail? And you don't think any of it is true? I don't know. Maybe some of it is. Some of it is interesting to think about. Kind of like when we used to spend all that time wondering if Jay-Z was really in the Illuminati. But after a while, you know what I noticed about them conspiracy heads? What? That's all they talked about. They always found ways to insert it into conversations. They made it their whole life. As soon as I realized that, it turned me off. Why? Because it's another trap. Just like Manny, the crew. If I went down that hole, that's all I'd think about too. I'd just be wasting more and more time. He waved the waiter over for the check, like he was planning on paying it. I fucked up once, but I ain't about to do it again, he said.
That is just such a powerful conversation right there.
That section too was also really informed by teaching in prison. I taught in prison for a couple years, and sort of like thinking about how those guys like saw themselves and saw their actions and like where they ended up and why. Like it was such a broad spectrum of opinions and thoughts about it, and it just like didn't look like what people would have imagined, right? Speaking to a person actually incarcerated in that moment. Um, and I wanted to, with Geo, kind of like illustrate that complexity, right? Like it's not, he's, he's not necessarily sidestepping the fact that like there are big systemic issues that are at play, but also he's sort of like, if you're stuck in that situation and you want to make a choice, someone like him, he decides, well, I'm gonna just try to I'm here already. What am I gonna do? You know what I mean? What am I gonna do now? And a lot of that was informed, I think, by not only my own family who's been incarcerated, but other people that I taught and spoke to. So
So you just mentioned that really casually that you taught people who are incarcerated. What were you doing? Tell me more about that.
I taught with this great program called Exchange for Change, and I taught creative writing to incarcerated males in a prison over here in Florida in the Everglades. And I taught them like just right intro to poetry, fiction. We did a little bit of like nonfiction, argumentative writing. I was trying to subtly teach them how to they needed to argue for themselves, how to maybe do that a little bit better. So yeah, it was an amazing time. I had at the time I was teaching those guys and then also teaching at the University of Miami where I was a graduate student. I was teaching also the same intro to creative writing class. And so I was like in this very, wealthy university where like kids were driving Porsches and stuff and then driving to the Everglades to teach guys in prison. and it was a really interesting experience. But I love the guys in prison, that class so much because they were so um, eager to learn. They were so happy that I didn't look at them as like a prisoner. I was just like, you're my student. I didn't ever ask about what they did. I don't really care. It wasn't my business. I was just there to teach them, and they seemed to really appreciate that. And we just had a really wonderful time. And I feel like um, you know I learned, like, it's cliche, like I learned more from them than from me, but I feel like I did. I learned a lot from their perspectives and just like their outlooks on life and how different it was, and varied, and even in that room. Again, an example of like when you put a whole swath of people like formerly incarcerated, and it's like, here's what they think. It's like, well, you have to talk to them individually, right? Because they all have different opinions, and so yeah, it was a wonderful experience that I hope I can go back and do it again soon when I have some more time.
And you were able to channel at least some of that, right? Or pick some pieces of that and put that into
Yeah,
Geo.
some of that was that, and then some of it was also, sort of imagining. Like, I have a good friend of mine that I grew up with who, I lost touch with him, but he's been homeless, and we kind of see him around the neighborhood sometimes, and he's really had a rough life, and I've tried to connect with him at times, but it's been difficult, and sort of like imagining what his outlook might have been like, you know, had he gone out of prison and we had a conversation, like taking bits of that sort of imagining, and also what I heard actually being in the prisons, and like that really went into forming Geo and his like perspective, trying to tap into how it's not as like black and white as someone would imagine.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Andrew Boryga, and you're listening to Check This Out on New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about Andrew's brand new debut novel, Victim, and we are digging into the friendship between Javi and Geo gets out of jail, and Javi sees this as a moment where maybe he can channel it for his career. Right? He's not necessarily thinking about the friendship, the nice stuff. Remember, he's not a likable, lovable character. And so he goes to meet Gio at this diner. They're going to have a talk, and he's hoping he can write about it. And he wants to be a savior. He wants to write it as a savior piece.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic. By the end, he's doing the thing that, sort of turned him on to all this in the first place. Yeah, he's happy to see his friend, but he's also walking over to meet him and realizing this is a great story. This is the story that I need to tell now. And the whole interaction of them reuniting is colored by the fact that really he's not even trying to understand what happened to his friend, or really like just spend time with him, but trying to like get the best, juiciest possible story that he can get out of him to spin it to this magazine, because they're sort of breathing down his neck for the next story, and he doesn't really know what to do.
But he writes up the piece like he's saved Gio.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So he writes up this whole story. Well, he asks Gio for his participation in it. Gio says, "I don't have nothing to do with that, but do whatever you want." And he takes that as an sign that he can do it. So he writes up this whole piece, like he re-educated Gio about all the, social inequalities, that he doesn't understand, the deeper meaning of things, that he shouldn't, why he should have this sort of outlook when he gets out of prison, and how he needs to, sort of understand all the deep forces at play on his life that he's like overlooking. And it's like written in this way that, it's sort of like catnip to people who are looking for that sort of like redemption story after prison, and awakening moment, instead of the real story, which is like Gio has these conflicted ideas about himself and what happened to him and his decision making, who's responsible. The more nuanced story. So Javi writes that other story. It obviously does really well, launches him to like another level, and he now is he's invited onto this television program where it's sort of the beginning of the end for him.
But he's sort of flipped, just like you said, which is why I loved that was how you ended his career. He wrote it up as this savior story, and yet the nuance story for me was so much more interesting.
In a lot of ways, those stories are more interesting, but they're just more they could be harder to tell, and they can make people uncomfortable, right? There's a lot, like when I was in the prison, like I would hear things, I'm like, it makes you uncomfortable, and like you don't, it's not what you're expecting. It's subverting expectations, and that's hard for a lot of people to digest. It's hard for even publications and publishing houses to digest, when they don't want to offend, they don't want to like, it's like everyone's managing expectations and audiences around here, and it can be difficult to tell those stories sometimes. But yeah, I agree. I think that's the more interesting story.
Andrew, we've talked a lot about labels and using a lot of these words that Javi learned when he got to college. Are these actually having the effect of flattening rather than expanding diversity?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that happens with labels. Labels like POC, people of color, marginalized, BIPOC is a new label now too. Like, and to me, real diversity to me is like the individual's story, wherever they're from, their makeup, background, whatever. Obviously, they might have come from certain cultures or regions or so on that inform them, but everyone is sort of different, right? Like I think about the kids that I grew up with in my building in the Bronx, and maybe on paper we all look the same, but we had very different personalities, interests, um, places that our life took us. You know what I mean? And that's like in every building in New York City. That's in every building in the country, right? And I think that there's a lot of just kind of you know, flattening that happens. And I don't think it's done maliciously. I think it's people trying to elevate like whole SWAT. We need to get these stories out there and these, groups of people and like get them represented. But I think the the mistake happens when trying to like appoint like a certain narrative as the representative, right? Or a certain perspective as like this is their perspective, right? Because then if anybody doesn't fit into that, they're sort of cast out, and and it's like, well, those are valid as well, right? There's it's a wide range of things. So, it's a difficult problem to crack, but I personally I'm quite optimistic. I think that we are moving in a better direction right now. I think in terms of the stories that are being told, in the realm of like film, television, even a story like American Fiction, being a big Hollywood movie and winning, the Cord Jefferson winning an Academy Award for the script. Like, I know people, not everybody loved that movie, but the fact that it's made and that it's out there and that's a whole perspective that's allowed to like be out there, that to me represents progress. Like there's an understanding, like okay, like you know, we can have a wide variety of types of stories. They don't have to be this like like three main versions that we've been telling the whole time, and I feel like we're already moving in that direction. I just hope we see more of it.
So, Andrew, we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the writing process itself and being a novelist. So, what advice do you have for new writers?
I think try your best, um, to like focus on the work and not on what you imagine how the work will be received, or like focus on the fun of just creating, and chase the fun. I really had fun writing this book. Like I read stuff back and I laugh myself. So it's like I had a really good time doing it, and I think that comes off the page. I've heard from a lot of people that they really laughed a lot and they had a good time reading it, even though it does touch on all of these heavy subjects. And I think that's partly because I made sure to chase that fun when I was writing.
It's great advice. Andrew Boryga, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was awesome.
You've been listening to Check This Out, a new literary series, which is a partnership between New Hampshire Public Radio and the Howe Library in Hanover, New Hampshire. We dive deeply into the works of emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. Our producers today are Megan Coleman and NHPR's Jessica Hunt. The Howe Library Director is Ruby Simon. NHPR's Program Director is Emily Quirk. The show is sponsored by CNS Wholesale Grocers Family of Companies, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, and the Howe Library Corporation. Thanks for listening. See you next time.